Well, ColinGray, you know, if you haven't seen the show, you have to see this show. Colin came from England in the early 80s to Santa Barbara to do his graduate work here, and has stayed, and has raised his family here. His daughter Chloe may be in the audience tonight, but Chloe is also a student here. So we're really proud to have this family thing going on here. Colin has won many awards. He has work in public collections, and you're going to show all the public art things tonight. In Santa Barbara, there's 2 public art pieces. Los Angeles has one. He's shown all over America, New York City, Los Angeles, as well as this town. And he's well known and loved in his community. Some of you people may have seen a sculpture a few years ago on State Street W. Anybody see that piece? They made a movie about it. It was in the film festival. Well, sort of about it, sort of about the things that happen around it. So we have a star in our midst, a Hollywood star. Anyway, we're so pleased to have him here. Will you please welcome ColinGray?
Thank you, Dane. Thank you all for coming. And can everybody hear me? Oh, just the volume. Okay. So, how about now? Okay, that's about. Is that good? Do you still need more? Even more? I'm going to blow a speaker. About there. Okay. So, well, I usually start talks and I don't quite know where I'm going to begin and just see what happens. And about an hour ago, a pair of shoes that I got on eBay, real cheap, real nice shoes, came to the door. And when I was just thinking all about intuition and the imagination, and so I was opening this box, you know, and out popped this little card. It said Jaywalk Manual. And then there was a knock on the door, and in walked a guy called Jay, and I thought, and then I saw, well, what's this about, you know? And it says, familiarity breeds contempt. I thought, well, that's just interesting, out of a pair of shoes. And is that good volume still? Good. Let your feet do the walking, which is kind of like the idea of all those that wander are not lost. And then it had make all left or all right turns. So it's giving you sort of ways of proceeding, thinking, well, what can I do to today that's different, and what will end me up in a place I wouldn't possibly have expected. And so flip a coin. Anyway, so I thought, well, I'm on the right track. Imagination, intuition. So that's partly what I'm going to be talking about today, as well as the slides of my work. And also this lecture, talk, whatever, what is it?
It's your show.
My show today is about, what is it? Oh yeah, it was geared towards City College students. So I see there's some heavy-duty people here, and so I hope it doesn't get boring for you guys who know most of this stuff. And so anyway, I guess we should. Oh yeah, and I brought all these folders, and then you know I'm looking through them, and I'm thinking, why did I bring this? It's this sense of like, you walk out the house thinking, yeah, I got everything. You know, there's got nothing in it. But I thought it would be quite fun to start off with a couple of poems that I wrote. I believe in these are funny poems. I'm not a poet at all, but I like to write little poems, and sometimes I work in museums and places like that. And if there's a wall being built or something like that, I'll write a poem and put it in behind, so that maybe 10 years down the road, 5 years, 6 months, you know, someone will find the poem, you know. So, there's one I started. I don't have the full poem of this one, but it says, this one's poems. Where are all the poems? The poems are all in hiding in their poems. See, I told you there were some heavies in the room. They walk to the Golden Bank. They fed their little dogs. They check on the stock market for the latest price in hogs. Poems. Where are all the poems? Poems are all hiding in their anyway, it goes on. So, all right. So I thought I'd start with that. It's like the starter act, you know. Oh yeah. This was one I hung a show at the Cohen Center for Theoretical Physics. It's the place where all the brain boxes of all the planet go there and do their work. It's amazing minds go to that place. So I wrote on their blackboards, your cosmic poet, they talk in terms of like the micro, they talk in terms of the macro, so they're talking in terms of dust and horizons and fields, all the big stuff, but they're really talking about the micro stuff. Hi. So your cosmic poetry fills my ears, you folk of particle dust. The question is not just how far, but in what horizon to trust. I bet they hated finding that on their board. So anyway, I shall move on. Maybe we can have the slides.
The lights. As soon as you get a slide up, I'll turn off the lights. I think you have to. Can you reach over and turn on the lights?
Yeah, it needs to.
Far left.
Yes, sir.
Keep going back. Keep going back. Right, that one there. Pull it forward.
There we go.
See, you know.
Oh yeah, that's the second
there's
slide.
The digital range.
So you want to go back one?
Okay.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know England too well, I'm from down here in that little mouth. It's called Torbay, and it's a rural part of the world. Next slide. And it's Devonshire. And so it was a rural kind of community with lots of farmyards and so forth. Very little industry, but a lot of tools lying around farmyards and so forth. And lots of gardeners there. So I want to locate the notion of what the origins of my work are. And there was one point where I felt very baffled when I went to my art teacher at high school and said about some sort of artwork that I took it to the teacher, and I said, how did they see this? And they said, well, that's the way they saw it. And I thought, well, I don't see it like that at all. Like, you know, how do they get there? And so it was really baffling. And so in some ways, this talk is a little bit about unbaffling it. There's a better word for that, but I've forgotten what it is now. So next slide. So I'm surrounded by that as a youth. And then about 10 or 11 years old, I was taken to the Tower of London by my aunt. And it was very exciting because in Devon, you live 200 miles from London, and it's the equivalent of like going to like Chicago from here. It's like absolutely a million miles away. And so I went up there, and when I went to the Tower of London, and I saw one of these blades, and it really amazed me. I thought it was a beautiful thing. It's called a crease, and this one was actually in Chicago because I couldn't find the one in London when I went there to rephotograph it. But it's a very similar kind of thing. And I was really amazed at this object, and I thought it was really beautiful. And it really baffled me also. I didn't have a place to put this idea, and I think when you don't have a place to put some new information, you have to build a little place in your mind to put it there. So I had to build a little bit of my mind to put it there, and it made a big impression on me. But then I forgot about it completely. Next slide. And I also saw these pikes. And as you can see, very often in those days, the days when these pikes were made, they were designed by artists very often. Artists would design armor also, and they'd be like the best. It'd be like Giorgio Armani would be, you know, you'd have come on over, you know, I need a suit of armor, I want to look big in the shoulders, and I need some red fluff coming, you know. And so they'd design it and be like, wow, that's great, thanks, Giorgio. And they'd go back to Italy and they'd produce for someone else. So there's Leonardo da Vinci designed this kind of thing too, and they're very beautiful in some ways, even though they're very, what they designed to do obviously is very brutal, but hopefully they're scary enough so they never actually had to do that. But so this is when I'm 10 or 11 years old. Okay, next slide. And probably a little focus on that one. And so I also had an object called a 10-in-1 machine when I was a kid, and it was great. It was like a Swiss Army knife, but it was, you know, made out of plastic and stuff. And I really loved this object, and so I found this picture on the internet or in a book or something. So I thought my circuits would have blown if I'd seen that when I was a kid. But I just thought everything in one. You have this thing, and it's got everything. It's kind of like an iPhone, actually. You know, it's a modern equivalent. You know, it's just this amazing piece of equipment. So, of course, this was in the early 60s, I guess. So, next slide. Another thing that influenced me in my youth was this is W. Heath Robinson, and he was a cartoonist between World War I and World War II. And this is a man swimming the Channel, And so his humor, this notion of everything, again, it's a little bit like the Swiss Army knife, but everything that he needs for his trip across the channel is right there. And so this is kind of comic attitude, but actually he was very good at drawing too, and he was very creative. Very creative. He designed these things to win World War I, like giant magnets that you dangle over the army, the opposing army, and it pulls all their buttons off and so on. Very nutty stuff. But I was embroiled in this stuff as a kid, you know, and so it was kind of like exciting to me. Okay, next slide. And this is kind of like building a house from the top down. You know, it's like it's really not smart, but it's kind of like a fun way of trying to do it. You know? Okay, next slide. And so I was in art school, and I was fairly good at drawing. This is back in the early 70s now, and I was making things that I kind of liked them, and other people kind of liked them, and yet there was a certain kind of, somehow I was doing the things I felt like I ought to be doing rather than the things that I really wanted to do. And there was one day when I was on my way to my studio, and I thought, if my studio was burning down, what would I run and get? And the answer came back to me, nothing. And it was a little bit of a shock, because I thought, wait, you would have thought there's something I'd want to get from my studio. But not really. And so I thought, well, there's something wrong. So what would it be that I really would want to run and get, you know, before it all burnt down to nothing? And then I thought, well, I actually want some tools, some hand tools, because I didn't have a lot of money in those days, and so I had to borrow tools. So I thought, well, I'd like to have some hand tools, hammers, saws, pliers, screwdrivers, drills. Thank you. So yeah, so I started making some. I started embarked on making them, and every time I started making a sensible object, even like a bag to go to the supermarket with, because you didn't get, in those days, you didn't get like ones there. You had to take your own, and so I'd make them, and they would come out kind of funky. And so next slide. And so this was one of the first tools I made. This was a two-man shovel. And so it was, and I thought, well, this is an odd thing, but I actually couldn't deny that I liked it, even though it's a really kind of bonkers in a sort of way. It is absurd. And I also was curious about the notion of absurdity, because I think there's a lot of absurd things in the world. I mean, a lot of the things we do are really absurd, because this life is basically very simple. We need to feed ourselves, we need to clothe ourselves, shelter, and human company. And the rest is kind of, we make it really nuts, you know. So anyway, next slide. And so I started making, this was about 7 feet tall shovel, and then I made next one. And I ended up making about 20 of these shovels. This is about 1974 to 75. And it satisfied both my desire to have practical objects, and yet it still clung to the notion of making things that were beyond practicality, that were a little lyrical, if you like. So, next slide. I made things like this a little bit later, really kind of, this is like paintbrush gone wild. And at this time, the odd thing was, I actually didn't find my work funny at all. I didn't, and I just didn't. I was very serious about it, and it was like, I mean, I see the humor in it now, but at the time it was like, it was just a desire to see it like that. I didn't have any opinions either way of whether it's funny or not. So, next one. I did drawings of like drill bits and things like that. Is that in focus? Barely. Okay. There you go. All right. So, yeah. Next slide. Yeah, that's. Also, I started to imitate industry. I saw the movie Catch-22, and there was something Enterprises in there. Do you remember that movie? Yeah. And M&M Enterprises. And I decided to start my own enterprise, and I called it ColinGray Enterprises. And much like the notion of making a decision and just moving with that decision, i.e., like that little book that said, you know, take every right you can take, you know, it's like I started this notion of imitating industry. And so I did everything I could to imitate industry. So I was starting to work with blueprints rather than working on paper. And so I did a number of these drawings. Next slide. So this is a very typical house in the north of England. Two up, two down. Well, it was before I did that, so, you know. And I went in for a competition that was what to do with a giant square chimney. And I thought, well, you could make it into a monument to the north, you know. It's like, but anyway, they didn't go for it. This was just left in a drawing. Next slide. But I did do this is in the Serpentine Gallery in London, and I did make this bust that was the same notion too. It's like the condensed. Okay, next slide.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
Could you just tell us about the materials of this? Is this like plywood or what is this?
The plywood and dowel and paint, essentially. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. This was, I call this the happiest brush in the world. This is about 1975. And the irony was someone saw it and made a reproduction of it, and it was introduced in a thing called Anno 1980 or 1979 in England. It was a design company got hold of it. And they worked out how to make them and box them. And I was thinking, that guy's crazy? But I didn't want to say anything because it was kind of fun. Just to, no. They probably still got it. So, also, it's like I remember my next slide. My art teacher saying, "This is the notion. This is the ultimate brush." And if you remember the images of the Swiss Army knife, it was my version of that in a kind of way. It was like, what thing could you buy that would have everything on it? Actually, this is photographed when it was a little bit beaten up because it was a little bit beyond its best here, but it gives you an idea of what it's like. And also I had an interest also in what an art teacher said to me. He showed me a Rembrandt drawing of Saskia's wife on his lap, and many people probably know this. He's holding a glass of wine, and he's laughing, looking back at you, the viewer. And he said, "Look at that! It's at the beginnings of Rembrandt's life." And then he said, later on, "This is the end of his life. It's all dark and gloomy, and everything's, you know, strange." So I kept that in mind, and I felt like it's interesting that we don't live these straight ahead roads from beginning to end. I thought I started being curious about the notion of change as things moved on, to parallel our lives as we get older. So we'll get to that a little bit later. And also, I was now I'm very interested in the notion of the roots that supply the information that go up the trunk, that come up and exit out the fruit of a tree, and that we as creative people are kind of like that. So next slide. Yeah. Okay. All these come apart. They're not terribly functional. I nearly cut my hand off, well, my thumb, chopping brushes up to get the bristles out of that. So, next slide. This is a backpack that I designed. I thought there was an exhibition called Art into Landscape, and I thought, well, I like backpacking, so, you know, and I saw that the little fins are for where you put your socks. And someone stole this from an exhibition, so maybe it's going around England actually doing its thing. You know? Yeah. So, next slide. Oh, your cameras, yes. Just before I left England, someone gave me an etching plate and said, well, why don't you do something? It was a master printer. He said, why don't you do something on this? And so I did this drawing of this camera. And because I tend to make things, at this point I really wanted a camera and I couldn't afford one. And I just really wanted one. I couldn't afford, wanted, you know how it is. You know, you go to the store and I don't know if you like, I look in the windows late at night, I drool. I can't afford it. So I started making these things, and next slide. And so these are made out of varnished, polished wood, lacquered wood, that's right, lacquered wood. And I made next slide. I made them to imitate industry. This was a product of ColinGray Enterprises, and the lenses are all interchangeable, and that was the idea. In fact, it was, and I sort of think that going back to the wandering and the intuition, that one day, because there's lenses in there, I ground the lenses. You can't actually use them, but you can look through them. But I wanted the lens to look rounded, so I got plexiglass rod and I rounded it out and I made it into a lens. And I think we can make lenses. It's not that difficult. And I use them for glasses, but I mean, you can actually magnify things. And one day I was looking. The lens was like 1 inch, and the opening was like 1 1/8 inch. And so I had 1/8 of an inch gap between this lens and this wooden hole that I created. So I was thinking, what am I going to do? How am I going to find something that's the inside dimension is 1 inch and the outside dimension is 1 1/8 inch? And I thought, well, it's time to go for a walk. And so I walked out of my studio and I walked past a bicycle store, and I looked down on the ground. This is about 4 minutes later, right? And I looked down on the ground, and there was these little tubes on the ground that the handlebar tape used to be on. And so I picked one up and I thought, kind of looks like the right size. So I walked back to my studio and it slid over the tube and it slid in. I mean, it was perfect. So it's life is somehow like that. Okay, next slide. And the next one. I try to take those photographs so they're like advertisements of the day, So next slide. And I started going on this theme. I think, well, I'm about tools, and I went into this. I was very interested in North American Indian art, particularly the Kwakiutl Indians, and their wonderful masks. And so, this next slide. So I started imitating industry again, and this was the Stanfield and Goss Pure Power tool. The power went straight into the blade. It was very dangerous. But I figured you can buy chainsaws, and they're really dangerous, so why can't you buy art that's really dangerous? And so I sort of thought, well, it's time. So this is an interchangeable blade. But next slide. And I started making some radios. This is about 1982, 3, something like that. And the irony is they're kind of like that now. So, and these actually worked. I had little speakers in them and things like that. And so next slide. There they were. Next slide. And then I was invited to take part in a show, an exhibition of chairs in town. And so I made this one. And a gentleman that bought it, this was the first time I'd ever sold anything that was like a goodly amount of money for me. And and the gentleman that bought it, it was called Also Available in Blue, because it was a ColinGray Enterprise production, and I was, that's what they say in about magazines, So I made this one, and then about 6 months later, the gentleman that bought it called me up and said, "I understand you have another one in blue." And so I was thinking, so I said, actually, I don't. It was the title. I didn't lie and make another. And so he said, well, I have maybe an opportunity for you to show some more. And so next slide. So I ended up making probably about 13 of these chairs. And yes, it's uncomfortable, yes. Next slide. And this was a show in San Francisco that I had. Next slide. And then after all that lacquering and painting and sanding, I was in my studio one day and I had a tennis ball, and I was kind of bored, and so I thought, well, I got this lino cutting knife, and I popped it into the tennis ball and kind of peeled it like an orange and hung it on the wall. And I kind of liked that. I thought, well, given how much work I had to do my last works, it was kind of nice to have this kind of curious shape with so little effort. And so I did another one, and then I started challenging myself to do 5 more, and I did 5 more, and I challenged myself to do another 10, and I did 10 more, and I ended up 40 and 50, and I think, well, I'll try to get 60 different ideas. And next slide, and next slide, and I ended up with 200 of them, and so this piece was called Oddballs. As you know, there is no other name really. And so, and unfortunately, Oddballs. And I did actually have a piece of writing about this piece that I did, but unfortunately I couldn't find it. It's in a little catalogue, and it starts off. It was like the artist's statement, and I thought rather than write the artist's statement, which drives me crazy, I thought I'd just go deeper into the craziness of this piece, and so I wrote about all the different types of cut and the different names of the cuts and the incisions and everything like that. So next slide. And I started moving outwards a little bit, using the same process, very simply cutting things. It's called Red Brooms, and it's...
Colin, this is mid-80s? Is that what?
This will be mid-80s, yeah. So this is and Red Grooms is an artist, and I thought it would be kind of a little pun on him. And so next slide. And then one day I walked into my studio, and there was a sculpture there that was half built, and it wasn't working. It'd been there about 4 or 5 months, and I said out loud at 7 o'clock in the morning, nobody else was around, what can I do to make you work? Because I was kind of fed up with it being there. And the answer came back immediately is, we're never going to work. Why? Because you don't like old tools. This was a thing made out of old tools. And so that day I went out and I bought new tools. And one of the things I thought was that I would do anything to make this sculpture work, even do things outside my philosophy of what art should be. And it was a major turning point in my work, because I realized up until that point that I was trying to force my creativity to do things rather than asking my creativity what it wanted to do. And at that point, everything changed, and so I realized I had the cart before the horse. I feel as if one's creativity is bigger than we are, and our minds are little, so we have to give a lot of room to our creative selves to let it, whatever it is, do what it wants to do. So next, oh yeah, and by the way, thank you. About 10 years before this was made, actually mid-80s, I started doing the wavy handled things, and here's the first one I did. It's hard to see in there. There it is, let's see anyway. That's me and friends. We're all holding tools, but mine's wiggly. And that's the first one I did. Now, I didn't realize at that point that I'd completely forgotten about the event going to the Tower of London and seeing the wavy bladed dagger. And once I remembered, I thought, I'm on the right track. I'm bringing things from my own life, my own past, and bringing it into my art. And that was very rewarding for me to realize that. It made me feel like I was heading the right direction. Okay. Next slide. So it's the one in this. This is from about 1987, 88, something like that. I moved into a studio that was full of. There was a woodworker that was there before me, and I liked the way all the wood was just leaning against the wall, very, very simply. And so I made a piece that was out of the pieces of wood, and this is. It's faded a little bit in time because it's been underneath a house for 20 years. But this was the origins. Next slide. I went away and worked I taught in Bloomington Normal, Dane used to.
Indiana.
Illinois State.
Illinois State, yeah, where Dane used to be. And I didn't have my usual stuff around me, so I started drawing. And I started drawing things that were like these whimsical, lyrical kind of sculptures. And I did a whole bunch of them. And next slide. And I started making them. And next slide. This would be like the late 80s at this point. You see the drawings on the wall. This is my former studio. Oh, if only I had it now. And you see things kind of in the making there. This is everything kind of unfinished wood at this point. Next slide. It's called Green Machine, 1987, 88, something like that.
Colin, what did you say? What machine?
Green.
The Green Machine.
Green Machine, yes. Yeah. So I brought these poems along. I've listened to anybody know David Wyatt, poet? Yeah. Well, he's written this. He did this thing called the Poetry and the Imagination, and it's a fantastic talk that he gave about poetry and the parallels with the imagination and how it worked. And he wrote a couple. He actually had brought out a couple of poems. This one's by Antonio Machado, and it says a wonderful thing. This is a little bit of a challenge, and it brings me up and makes me think. Keep going in a sort of way with the imagination. It says, "The wind one day came to my soul with an aroma of jasmine. The wind said, 'In exchange for this jasmine odor, I would like all the odor of your roses.' I said, 'I have no roses. I have no flowers in my garden. All are dead.' And the wind said, 'Then I'll take the waters of the fountains and the yellow leaves and the dried up petals.' But the wind left and I wept. I said to my soul, 'What have you done with the garden entrusted you?'" Oh. Yes, anyway, okay, back on track here. Yes, a little challenge there.
So with the Green Machine, you wouldn't have to worry about your garden, right?
No, it's an automatic. Okay, next slide. My dentist, my doctor owns this. Supporter of the arts, thank you. Next slide. These are called things like trick of the trade and tools of the trade. Next slide. This one's defunct, no longer with us. Several of them are no longer with us. Next slide. Some of them revert to being regular tools again. This one was bought by the Hetchinger collection, which is their East Coast. Anybody from the East Coast? They used to have hardware stores. Yeah, you did? Yeah, yeah. Well, he and his family bought a bunch of art related to tools. And they bought this, and they made a big glossy book, and there was this piece in it. But they photographed what I considered to be the back of it, which wasn't bad, but it was like anyway. It was kind of like, oh yeah, okay. Next slide. Oh yes, this is the Balboa building from above. It's actually a model, but you can see it. There's State Street down there. I was asked to, what would I do with this rooftop, which is in the middle there. This is about 55 feet by 50 feet, almost rectangle. And
Colin, could I interrupt? To just describe where this is. If you all know where Paseo Nuevo is,
yeah,
you see where the red tile building is there. If you were walking in that way, you'd see the movie theater. Mel's Tavern is right there, so you get an idea where that is on State Street.
Klausner owned it.
that's right. Yes,
But he began the contemporary art school in that building.
that's it. Yes, yeah. So anyway, they said to me, what would I do with the rooftop if I had an opportunity to do something with the rooftop? So I said, well, I would take the vents and things like that are on the rooftop and make more of them. And they said, well, it's the vents that we actually don't like. And so I said, oh, okay. Well, listen, just give me a few days and I'll give you an example. And so they liked what I came up with, and they let me do it. So next slide. So this is looking down from the 6th floor, and we can still hear me at the back? Okay. And this is looking down from the 6th floor down onto the top. And as you can see, there's I call this decoy ducts because I figured, whatever. So these are real ones. You can see they're there, and there, and there, and there, and there. And these are the odd ones, I guess. And so next slide. And I ended up painting them because as you look down onto the rooftop, you also see Santa Barbara. And Santa Barbara is like the orange roofs, the green trees, and the black top. So I wanted it to blend in as much as possible. So this was about the early 90s. Okay, next slide. Oh yeah, I love bicycles. And this is such a great bike. This is a Cook Brothers bicycle. And I really wanted a new pair of wheels. And I already had a good pair of wheels, but same thing, cameras, looking in the store, 9 o'clock at night, drooling. And wanted the wheels, got some already, want some more, but back and forth, back and forth. And so I decided to make some wheels. And then one day I had some pieces of paper, and there was sort of there were sample papers. They're very nice papers, but I'd been carrying them around from studio to studio and got fed up with it. So I thought, okay, use them now or throw them away. And so what I did, I started drawing immediately. I thought, well, don't throw them away, just draw. So I started doodling, drawing, and then I started drawing wheels. And next slide. And later on, I made these drawings a little big, about 12 inches by 9 inches, and I got really obsessed with this image of the wheel. And I'd be waking up at 2 in the morning. I'd go to my table. I'd be drawing more wheels, and then I'd be waking up at 4 in the morning, drawing more wheels. And it gave me the sense of very often that we have, if we have an irrational desire for, in my case, wheels. Then it's worth, in an alchemical notion, is to put it in the crucible and heat it up and see what's really there. So I was going crazy looking at these wheels and choosing the hubs and choosing the spokes and the rims, driving myself crazy. And I was unconsciously doing just that. I was heating up this irrational desire in the crucible. And what came out was imagery of the wheels. Now, I actually eventually did buy a new pair of wheels, but I'd forgotten about those years ago. But I still kind of like these drawings. So it's interesting. I think half of our desires for things we consume in the stores are really these unconscious desires to make things or be creative with some kind of image or whatever. So next slide. And next slide. And also this just started, and this was about 1990, 91. The Kuwait conflict started. And so I didn't have a TV, and suddenly I got sick, and I wanted to have a TV so I could just not, lie there and staring at the ceiling. I thought I'd stare at TV, and I turned it on. Of course, the Kuwait conflict started, and I was thinking, oh my goodness. And so this craziness of the wheels sort of, I think, influenced that very much. Next slide. So they're going so wild, they're actually breaking apart themselves. And next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And next slide. And next slide. And next slide. Next slide. You recognize that? And I did other things as well. Next slide. And then another thing that I really wanted when I was a teenager is Italian pair of bicycle hubs. Right? Oh yeah, sorry. Okay. So these are, I always said it Campagnolo, but lots of Americans have said no, it's not pronounced like that. Can you see that? How about that? There we go. Okay. So there we are again. These come back, and now they're drawings, and I never got these. Sad tragedy. So so this began another series of works with the twin wheels, and now the shovels have returned. from my childhood imagery, because I was so used to tools being around my yard and so forth. Now they're digging at the ground. Next slide. And then now the wheels are breaking away, leaving the shovels spinning by themselves. Next slide. Parts of the wheels sometimes still attached, and the shovels are becoming like long and elongated. Next slide. And now we've just got these very elongated shovels, and somehow this little axle in the middle still left, spinning. Next slide. And I went to India. Do you want to sharpen that up a little? Yeah, great. Oop. Oh, there we go. Okay. Then I went to India, and I'd been to India already before I started this. But I saw this is called Rangoli drawing, and people draw them outside their homes in the morning, or sometimes their businesses. And I loved some of these shapes, and so I was keen on bringing that dynamism into my work. So next slide. And again, the trenches that have been dug. Now it's getting a little sort of strange looking and anthropomorphic maybe, and the spinning eyes coming into play, and the trenches being dug. The trenches are getting more interesting. Next slide. And I made this was a blurry sculpture, which I never showed it. It didn't work for me, but it was like I thought it'd be instructive to show. Next slide. And the trenches get more curious, and now this stuff starts to emerge out. So this is like 1991, 2, 3, something like that. Next slide. And then they start to have this spin. Next slide. Next slide. The trenches become really quite elaborate sometimes. Next slide. Next slide. This is obviously made into one of the tapestries. Next slide. I'm going to look at this actually because I haven't seen it in years. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And this is curious because I was doing this. This is pre-Photoshop. I didn't like this piece. I didn't know. It was just too sort of. But I thought I might do something with it again at some point. Next slide. Next slide. It's not a good slide of this one, but next slide. And at this point, I was really waking up in the morning, going to the studio, and just thinking, well, what happens today? And really allowing my imagination just to take over, do what it wanted to do. Okay, next slide. And then it completely splits off the ground at some point. And next slide. Next slide. So it really gets squished. It was very curious. Next slide. Okay. And so now everything is come up and is slumping down back into the earth. Next slide. And then we go back to that trench that was cut, and now there's a sort of and now the shovels have become very almost animal-like on the inside, and still with the axle, and this white kind of temple thing is built on their place, and so we're still following through with that imagery. Next slide. This is actually these are done in the early 2000s.
And these are still ink on paper?
Yes, ink on paper. It's still 12 inches tall by 9 inches wide. Next slide. Yeah, they are phallic. Next slide. You know, every now and then you have to. And then, exactly. And this was also taking things. I wasn't sure the way this came out, but I every now and then I look at it. It's not a thing I throw away, but it's some. It was maybe a little bit too animal, a little bit too off course. And I sort of think this is another thing I'm curious about, the difference between the imagination and fantasy. And I sort of think that I believe there is a difference, and it's not enough time to talk about now. But next slide. I think the imagination is like an actual faculty, and like we're not playing around when we use it. It's bringing forth something that's required. Also, yeah, David Wyatt talks about the imagination. This is where I'm curious about the way Rembrandt's notion, Rembrandt doing the funny earlier work and the later work gets darker. And David Wyatt talks about it. He says, the imagination, why it is scary. He says, because when you're truly imagining, we have to confront the disowned parts of ourselves. When we find the path we are supposed to take, because then we have to do something about it. What is scary is we have to take on what we have to take on. And so that's kind of a curious notion to me, that we can no longer turn back. It's not the imagination that's scary. It's because once we're shown what we have to do, we just kind of know we have to do it, and we know we're faking it if we don't. And so next slide. And so this is the beginning of a series that I did. Again, the structure on top of these trenches. Next slide. It was the beginning of 9, and I think I found some of them. Next slide. And slump in. And yet these things start to grow out. It's like a bad onion or something. Next slide. You can see the little parts of it left. Next slide.
Colin, have you ever shown any of these dark ones?
These particular ones? I think I showed a few of them one time. Yeah, briefly. Next slide. But these odd kind of flower things are emerging. Next slide. And that's the last one of that series. So, next slide. Oh yeah, and at the same time, I was asked to do, this is the early 90s now, I was asked to do a piece on one of the metro stations in Los Angeles, and it actually took me forever, because just at the point I wanted to work real little, like that big, like suddenly I got this letter saying, you have won the commission, and part of me was saying, oh no, I'll do it now. And so this is about 9.5 feet tall. And it took me years to do, because there was a point where I just ignored the fact that I had to do it. And finally, they actually came up from Los Angeles and knocked on my door. And then I did it. So I did it by 99, I think. But this has got riddles. What are we doing time-wise? Because it's about 25 after. Yeah? Okay. So essentially, people come to the platform for, say, between 30 seconds to like maybe 10, 15 minutes. And I thought I wanted the piece to reveal itself over time. So this is, these are riddles all the way around about the local history. And I read a 400-page book about the local history. And some curious things happened there. So I pulled things out of that and driving around, seeing things. And I made them into these riddles and put them around the edge. Next slide. It was, supposedly it was a cast stone, but it wasn't the kind of material I liked. It had sort of aggregate in the resin. So that, there was all kinds of legalities and things. And
which station is it?
it's Del Amo, yeah, on the way to Long Beach. Yeah. So, and it's actually there's a temple in India called the Temple to the Sun God in Konarak, and the stone it's a stone temple, and there's big wheels on the side, and they look just like this actually, except they're, yeah, you've seen, yeah. So next slide. And next slide. There it is. Next slide. Oh yes, and so there again, there's a project I got to do out in Isla Vista, Again, I'm bringing in the ideas I had already. These are kind of like the idea of these are places to sit. You kind of go into the dell and you go in there and sit in there. But then I thought at night you'd come across and you'd walk and trip on that and fall and break your neck. I thought it's probably not a good idea. Too bad. I love the idea of it. You having these little mounds and, it would be nice. But it could be lit and then you'd know, unless you would really, unless the lights went off and you wouldn't. Anyway, so next slide. There's sketches from my notebook. Next slide. Again, thinking in terms of like the built structure over the cross from the trenches, so forth. So it's bringing those kind of notions in. Next slide. And that got built. It won the competition and got built. And
Colin, could you explain what the competition was for?
Yes, good. There was a big rally there where 400 people got arrested for sitting down at trying to bring a peaceful resolution to the Vietnam War in about 1973, wasn't it? Yeah. 1970, yeah, June 23rd or something. And so they had a ceremony like so many years later on the day, and all people left the room who sponsored the piece, and one left and said, "Colin, I will kill you if it's not done by then." And I said, well, I didn't see that in the contract. But I had it done. I got it done. So next slide. So these are this foliage is in fact baby trees. Now it's right around the top now. And I also bought there's a woman called Angela Zarian. She's a cultural anthropologist. I think her work's very interesting. And she talks about the fourfold way to keep a life in balance. To have courage, and I forget what they are now because I was never very good at it. Wisdom, courage, and love and vision. Thank you. So some of us live that way. I think someone in the front rows here. Okay, next slide. No. Next slide. Next slide. It's a little. Next slide. I went in there one day, I found a marijuana plant in the middle. And so this pillar was once my pillar. It was given to me by the city to actually create a fountain on. Well, actually they didn't. They said around about here to create a fountain. I said, well, could I use the pillar? And they had a big meeting and said, yes. So I designed I was thinking about using the pillar to get some height for a fountain. And next slide. And I was curious about, this is a very, there's a very famous sculpture, it's called the Feathered Serpent. Quetzalcoatl. Yeah. And so essentially I was thinking, well, I was just pondering, I was thinking the water running down, the groove, things like that. And so next slide. Yes, and this notion it wouldn't, that was, people said to me, don't say anything about snakes, don't. So next slide. And so I started thinking about this kind of thing. I thought this looked too much like it might appear in Orange County or something, so I abandoned that one. Next slide. But I love the surface of snakes, so just that random, beautiful thing. Next slide. And so I designed, this is all the panels that go up the side, and it's a changing pattern, so I thought everyone would be different all the way to the very top. Next slide. And it would have looked something like this, where the water came in, ran down, and it was in these stone basins, and it ran out into a big circular sort of pool in the bottom that had a weir higher and then went lower, and you could sit on the edge all the way around. But
just so you all know, this is, if you know where Borders Bookstore is,
yeah.
Right to the left of it, before you get to the movie theater there. That's right.
And just, it's my pillar. This is all in CAD, ready to go. But anyway, they didn't do it. So next slide. This is out of my sketchbook. I love working in sketchbooks. I think it's really important to do that. I like the idea of this running woodblock prints, so they stamp out things in the ground. Next slide. This is my early attempt at Photoshop. Next slide. And there's one. It wasn't successful, but it was like it's you know, I thought I'd put some failures in there too. Next slide. Oh yes. So the slots of castles that they shoot arrows out of. So you can see the kind of influence coming in. See that?
Can you hold it in the light?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Like that. Yeah. So I like that kind of slot. And I did a whole series of these pieces with the water flowing through. Next slide. I started doing some just off a whim these kind of funky looking machines. I was thinking, what kind of fountains would they be like, you know? But then it got into a whole other thing. Next slide. That you see in the exhibition. Okay. I love these little drawings. They're like hearts, you know, funky hearts. But next slide. Next slide. Oh yeah, this is if you flip it sideways, which we might, it's like the Tower of Babel, and I haven't done a whole lot with this image yet, but I'm working on it. It's this notion of two completely different ways of looking at things, so opposite they don't even see each other. So I kind of like the idea. Again, you know, coming from the hubs, the spinning thing. Next slide. So these are all unfinished kind of things. This was, oh no, next slide. This was, yeah, so the W piece came out of hearing on the radio about Jose Bové, who knocked down who actually dismantled a McDonald's in France because he didn't think it was appropriate in his medieval village, and for a lot of different reasons. And I was promised I wouldn't dismantle one myself, but you know. So I was really upset with the way things were in a couple of years ago with policies, U.S. policies, so forth. And so I felt like, well, the truth is, I never felt more compelled to do anything that I did to making that sculpture. It's in the brochure. I don't have a slide of it. But that was one of the original drawings. Maybe you could pull it back. Yeah, it being knocked down. I had this notion of all these French farmers, you know, being really mad and throwing, you know, their arrows and pitchforks up there in the sign. So, yeah. Next slide. Also, I was doing this. I must have been in not feeling that great because these drawings were about sculpture that's been thrown away. This sculpture just got thrown in the river. They didn't want it, you know. So, next slide. And this one, this notion of sculpture where the artist who lives outside of the citadel takes his sculpture to the outside of the citadel, 11 o'clock at night, and you can imagine him going like, oh, God, they're going to love it. You know, they're going to put it down like this, you know, and sitting it there, you know, yeah, okay, they're going to look over and they're going to love it. And then he goes there the next day thinking they're going to invite me in to the citadel, and he goes in, it's full of arrows. And it's like, oh. So anyway, that was that one. Next slide. I don't know what else is left here. Oh, yeah, I just threw that in, did it one day. Next slide. I like shovels. Oh, no more? No more? Yes, okay. There was a few things I didn't do, but have we had enough here in the heat? We've had enough here in the heat. Okay.
Hold on.
All right.
Well, before. Sorry. Does anybody have questions?
Oh yeah.
For Colin.
This was one last thing. Oh yeah. I had a big interest in heraldry when I was in my mid-teen, well, sort of like 10 and 11, and so a lot of this imagery is very curious to me, and so that's why you see some of it brought into my present work. And also this piece was probably about that size as a sketch, and it was the first idea of, especially after the stuff that happened with the sculpture W. I thought, well, you know, maybe it's a good idea. You know, it's like you know, you have a piece of sculpture and then you have all these places to advertise on it, you know, attached to it. And actually, you know, that's why the sculpture is actually really kind of uninteresting unless you have the advertising attached to it. So anyway, it's an idea.
In the show, there's a drawing if you want to advertise on it.
Yes.
It says right on the drawing, space available until October 31st is when the show is. But since we're almost 3/4 through the show, you probably can get it for a better rate.
Discount.
Isn't that right?
Big discount. So,
Well, I think there was at least one question
I
here.
have a question. Colin, would
Yes.
you talk about your trip to Dubai? Because that's referenced
yes.
in the brochure. And
I went to Dubai as a scenic painter to work in what's called the Atlantis project. It was a you know, if you've seen a picture of Dubai, there's the palm tree, the going out to sea, and I worked on the very tip of it, and it's a very strange city. And essentially, I was a scenic painter, and what they're making there is an aquarium to make that looks like Atlantis. And because nobody actually knows what Atlantis looked like, so it's kind of a cross between science fiction and Egyptian. And so we were painting the walls and making them look very old with all the seepage coming down. And it was, as a project, it was absolutely incredible. I mean, it was seamless, and you'd walk in and think, well, that is bronze, you know, but it wasn't. It was some other thing. And the fish were there, and this fish tank was so big that when you looked into it, you couldn't see the other side, so it was like you were looking into the ocean. And but it's a very strange place. There's a lot of inequality there that's odd. You know, there's very, 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 very wealthy there, and then there's this kind of slave culture. Essentially, people working for $2 and $3 an hour, 10-hour days, sometimes 7-day weeks, and so it's an odd environment. And you know, people that I would say 99.9% of these workers, and there's tens of thousands of them held in. Well, they have their passports taken away and they're put in man camps, you know. And 99.9 of them would probably pass as the security, and it set off the whole profiling thing as looking like a terrorist. But I found the people to be so beautifully innocent. It was just uncanny to witness people with such a beautiful sort of tabula rasa, if you like. It was amazing. So yes, and I went there, and on the way there, I made a whole bunch of sketches of all these pipes going in these knots, and then I arrived, and it was not a place I would live, go on a holiday. You know, if I was being punished, I could understand being put there for a month. But it was hard. It was just hard. It was like I got off the plane. It was like, you know, it was like, well, something wrong. It was soulless, I found, because it was just like a big city being built, so it was like a giant work site, and everyone going around with their blue jumpsuits and their green jumpsuits, and you know, doing this bang, bang, bang. Yeah, it was hard. I was so glad to get back.
when was this?
That was March. No, not March. April. April. Yeah, I worked there for a month. So yes, not a place I'd go, but an interesting experience. There were some incredibly beautiful parts of it, no doubt. Not natural, because it was, you know, it's a desert on a beach, you know, essentially. You know, but the design, unlike here, where say if you go to a restaurant, you look out the window and whatever was there yesterday is what you will see today. In Dubai, they design that too. So because they have the opportunity, you look at the restaurant and then you see these things, and it's beautiful man-made lake. Or another thing which was breathtaking was all these cabins, and all the cabins had a little roof projection coming up, and with these curtains, you know, like just like light, breezy curtains with a little light on in each one. So it's all these like lanterns going off. Dozens and dozens and dozens, and so it's like magic land. And then the Maseratis going around, and you know, it was nuts.
There's a question here.
Yes.
So you were, now I've seen the palm tree, and I thought I thought those were homes of the end.
Yes, they are.
So you were
All the fronds are. There's homes all along, and apartments, or thousands of apartments. They're $1 million each, and they've all been sold. And where I worked was at the tip. There's a big hotel, and it's a resort, and part of the resort is this aquarium. Yeah, and so it actually caught fire September 3rd, but they put it out. It was just on the outside, and they opened it anyway. So Yeah, it was weird. I said, it burned down. It's just,
So does,
okay.
okay.
Any more
So you're down the
questions?
gap. So if you have
Thank
other
you so
questions,
much for
you can
coming.
talk to Colin afterwards, or we'll be here for a few minutes. But thank you all for coming. Colin, thanks a lot. We appreciate it.